had a very interesting conversation this morning. It's a really complex issue. And here's the other piece of it, which is security, which is front and center in people's minds all the time, it seems. One of the reasons we're doing this event here in Miami is Miami's a border town. We don't traditionally think of it as a border town, but I think if you live in South Florida, you know very well that it is a border town, not just because there are people from all over the place living in the community, but because we're surrounded by water. We're surrounded by a pathway into this community. So we've got a great panel, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we'll get started. So Rob, you have the mic, or do you want to give it to Emilio first? Or it's just picking up the sound. Yeah.
Emilio Gonzalez. I'm currently the airport director here at Miami International Airport, formerly the director of USCIS.
My name is Rob Jesmer, and I'm the campaign manager for Forward US.
Israel Ortega. I'm a writer for Opportunity Lives. We're an online news publication. I cover, among other issues, immigration, but also the economy.
I'm Edward Alden. I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington. I wrote a book some years ago about the impact of 9/11 on U.S. immigration and visa policies. Worked with Jeb Bush and Mac McClarty on a big report in 2009 on immigration reform. And then more recently have been focused particularly on the issue of border security and how to measure it and understand what's going on at the borders.
So I'm going to start with, this panel is national security on the border and then the homeland. So I'm going to start with Emilio and just ask you, Emilio, what are the pieces to that? What exactly does that mean, border and the homeland? What's the difference, and what are we talking about? We're talking about security.
I think actually the dynamics have changed quite a bit. And by the way, I read your book and really enjoyed it. You know, in the past, immigration and security were two separate things. And they were kept two separate things, which is one of the reasons why INS was bifurcated into three separate agencies. So you didn't have the same people being, you know, judge, jury, and executioner, if you will. And I think that's run full circle now. And now I think that immigration, whether we like it or not, is falling under national security. Maybe not as a principal issue within national security, but events have forced it on national security. And it doesn't get any better, because whether we like it or not, every time there's a terrorist event here in the United States, every time something bad happens and you can point to the perpetrator being an immigrant, a refugee, an asylum seeker, it just sort of continues to feed this idea that immigration and counterterrorism, immigration and national security have to be addressed at the same time. It may not be correct, we may not like it, but unfortunately I think it's what we're dealing with now, and we'll continue to deal with it in the near future.
I'm going to ask Ted to respond to that then.
A couple of, I mean, one of the things I tried to do in my book was to help us. I mean, I agree, I think in the public reception, there's no question that immigration and security are connected. But I think if you actually look at what's going on, there are really two challenges that are related but separate. And one is what I would call the garden variety control of illegal entry across the border, which has been, you know, the public debate going back to the 70s, but really escalated in the 1990s when we began to saw very high levels of unauthorized migration from Mexico. So we can talk a little bit about the progress that's been made there, which I actually think is far more significant than the public recognizes. The other is the use of border security as a national security tool. And this really came into focus. So it didn't start then, but it really came into focus after 9/11 because all 19 of the hijackers came initially to the United States on legal visas. And so we became aware of the vulnerability of our visa system. Again, I think there is a largely untold story of the progress that's been made. I don't think it's coincidence that the terror incidents that we're seeing in the United States now are being carried out by people who are already here. They're either green card holders or naturalized citizens, or they've been here for some period of time. You go back to the 1990s, all the terror incidents were at the hands of people who had come to the United States recently. And I think one of the big reasons for that is that if you're coming to the United States with the intent of carrying out a terrorist attack, it's a lot harder to get here than it was prior to 9/11. Our defenses against that sort of thing have improved dramatically. As we've seen, it doesn't make us invulnerable because you've got these domestically inspired folks, but I think there have been big improvements on both of those fronts.
Are we focused too much on the southern border?
It depends on what your purpose is. So if your purpose is to reduce illegal migration, no, because that remains the primary entry route. I do think there is growing awareness of the visa overstay problem, though that too has been shrinking. The numbers, unfortunately, in all of these are not as good as they should be. If you're talking about national security, then I think your concerns are much broader. They're I think, at airports, at the Canadian border, at seaports, any form of entry into the United States. Generally speaking, if you look back over the history, people coming in to commit terror attacks have used the legal channels. They haven't come across southern desert. They've come through the airports or legal ports of entry. So I think from a national security perspective, I do think we are overly focused on between the ports of entry on the southern border.
On the southern border. And when you and I spoke the other day, we talked a little bit about the northern border, which is a lot bigger and it's more porous. So why is that from a security standpoint, not a migration standpoint, but a security standpoint, what's the relationship between the two countries on the northern border?
Well, I mean, I think the major difference at the northern border is that the depth of cooperation between U.S. and Canadian authorities is much deeper than it is at the southern border. We've seen a lot of improvements in U.S.-Mexican cooperation, but there's still a lot of areas there that are essentially uncontrolled. When you're talking about U.S.-Canadian cooperation, the two sides are almost part of the same law enforcement force. We've got these, border enforcement task forces that work seamlessly across the border. You've got really perception of a common interest in trying to keep terrorists out of both countries. Again, not perfect. You could see things happen, but I just think there is a depth of cooperation there that makes the Department of Homeland Security more comfortable with the situation at the northern border than it is with the situation at the southern border. Again, not to underestimate the progress at the southern border, which has been enormous.
Okay. Rob, do you want to react to that?
Well, I largely agree with everything that's been said. I think that, I spend a lot of my time on Forward US. I spend the other part of my time trying to elect Republicans to office. And I noted what you said about the perception. The perception now, from a political point of view, I think is what we're fighting and something we have to deal with as it relates to passing reform. But I do think people feel like there needs to be dramatic improvement upon the southern border primarily. And look, there does need to be improvement. I think the numbers speak for themselves, but there's been a dramatic drop in people trying to come over, and a dramatic apprehensions have gone down because fewer people are coming over. And I think the border is much more secure than it was. But who is still trying to come over are a lot of them are good people, and some of them are bad people. There's the drug trafficking is still a huge problem in the southern border, and a major route for which drugs come in. And so it's not. At times, I feel like we forget that there is actually issues that need to be dealt with in the southern border.
So drug trafficking and human trafficking too, right?
Human trafficking is an enormous issue. I do a lot of work in Texas. Houston is a major gateway for this stuff. It's a big problem. So what we have now, in my view and my reading of it, and understanding, is that you have a lot fewer people coming over, but you have a lot of, I don't want to say more, but the ratio of good to bad people is not what it once was. And so and then I think you fast forward to whether it's the visa reform or I think it's a reasonable expectation for the country to know who is here and how long they're going to be here and what their kind of what their status is. And that's, I think, we got to do a better job on that stuff. And as was noted, we're doing a better job, but it's not perfect and it needs to be improved. And I think a huge part of that stuff. And then finally, I would just say, when you have some of these murders that have occurred, which by any measure are minuscule amount of the people who are here undocumented, it just does, from a perception point of view, from what I do for a living, it is a gigantic problem as far as just trying to sell this, because the reality is those people shouldn't be in our country, right? And they should be deported and or should have been deported. And so there's a lot of different, the facts on the facts on security are on our side, and to everyone's point, we need to do a better job selling them. But the perception of it is still something we need to overcome, and if we're going to be successful in immigration reform.
So Izzy, you're a writer. Can you help us frame how we would overcome that perception?
Right. Well, I think a lot of it is starting with the facts, because I do think that there is ignorance, frankly, by the American people, because oftentimes, headlines will sort of drive the narrative. I mean, we see examples of this where, like you noted, a drunk driver who happens to be undocumented, and then that sort of becomes the headline. And then because of that, it just makes it a lot more difficult to really get out the message that, when we're talking about undocumented immigrants, they're not really committing more crimes than the general population. I mean, this is something that the Pew has looked at, and other Congressional Research Service. I mean, other organizations that are nonpartisan have been looking at these numbers and have concluded that. And so I think it starts with that. I think it starts with really laying out the facts, but then it also starts with making sure that you've got the right people going out there and communicating these ideas. I think, unfortunately, because of how toxic the immigration topic can be, it's hard sometimes to find the right people to make that case. I think you're starting to see some people who are willing to stick their necks out politically. I was interviewing a freshman congressman by the name of Will Hurd, who represents 600 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border, and he's talking about that history that exists at the U.S. border, where people are, for generations, people have been crossing the border to go to school, to do business with one another, and so I think getting that out there more, because I think a lot of times people don't realize that there are millions of people living on the U.S.-Mexico border, and not all of them, and you don't have, these images of, people jumping across the border or committing crime at the rates that sometimes I think the news outlets can sometimes portray it to be. And so I think it's finding those right spokespeople, because someone like a Republican like Will Hurd and others, need to go out and talk to folks who have really have hardened their position on immigration, because they're more likely to listen to a Will Hurd than if it's a very lefty group where it's just not going to be a starter. Yeah. I mean, I think there are Democrats too, I think, who do want to see this too. I mean, not to continue on Texas too much, but Henry Cuellar too. I mean, he's another Democrat who has been looking at this, and I think he wants to be constructive with other Republicans. Mario Diaz-Balart, who of course a lot of folks know here from South Florida. These are folks that want to be a part of the solution, who are willing to work across party lines to get these things done. I don't think that you can separate, the economic with the national security concerns that would need to be addressed in some type of reform. But I think you need to find those members, particularly on the House side, because that's, as we noted in the earlier panel, I mean, that's really where the heavy lifting is going to be, I think, for next year, is finding those people on the House who are willing to be constructive, who are been studying this issue for a while now. I mean, I think that's another problem that I've noted from just working on the Hill, but also now covering the Hill as a writer, is that you've got a lot of folks who have not spent the right amount of time kind of studying the weeds of this and looking at the data, and are instead just sort of being misled by headlines and just different things that are factually not true.
So I want to keep pushing this issue, because you've brought up reform, and we're all very hopeful that the next Congress will afford that opportunity to have meaningful, common sense immigration reform. But before we do that, we really have to tackle this issue of vulnerability. If people feel vulnerable, they are vulnerable, right? So how are we really going to change minds, isn't it? Hearts, that's another issue. But how are we really going to do this? What is the most constructive way of? Yes, yeah. There you go.
You're going to pass that along.
Yeah.
Well, this is interesting. Part of my interest in border security came from my conviction, which remains today, that Americans in the Congress are just not going to move on the broader set of issues that's important in immigration reform unless there's some confidence that there's a reasonable degree of security at the border. And some of it goes back to the 1986 experience, when you had the legalization, the promise that this would solve the problem, and it was followed by record levels of illegal immigration. So I think this is a legitimate concern. The trouble I have with it is how detached the debate has become from what's actually going on. I mean, there was some hints to it here. There was a poll done about a year ago that asked Americans whether they thought illegal immigration was higher than it was a decade ago or lower than it was a decade ago. 70% of Americans think illegal immigration in the United States is higher than it was a decade ago. 83% of Republicans. That could not be more wrong. So if you just use the apprehension data, which is not a great proxy, illegal immigration in the United States is about a fifth of what it was a decade ago. The fine paper that the National Immigration Forum has put together here calls for better border metrics. This is something I've been working on for about the last 4 years. The Department of Homeland Security has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of your taxpayer money to come up with exactly this sort of set of metrics. It's there, they're sitting on it, they haven't released it. You can deduce some of the same information using public data, but the decline in illegal entry across the southern border is even more dramatic than the apprehension statistics would suggest. In particular because deterrence has grown. The fear of getting caught, of the consequences, increasingly people are being put in jail, the danger of the crossing, the cost of paying smugglers. Used to be that when Mexicans came and they were caught and sent back, they all came again. Now our research suggests that 60 or 70% are being deterred from making a second attempt. So there really has been this dramatic improvement in enforcement at the southern border, but we need to have a proper public discussion about it because nobody can really agree on what's an appropriate and achievable level of security. So, you know, our research suggests that there are still probably 250,000 successful illegal crossings every year. That's a tenth of what it was a decade ago, and a lot of those are probably the folks that Rob is talking about. So drug smugglers who are coming back and forth multiple times, so that isn't 250,000 people. But it's a legitimate question for our Congress. Okay, we're spending $18 billion annually on border enforcement. This is where we're at. How much more are we willing to spend to get that 250 down to 125 or 75 or 0, which is actually in legislation right now? That's the goal of the United States, 0 illegal entries across the southern border. Well, what would it take to get there? Is enforcement the best tool? Are there other tools? That's the sort of intelligent public debate we need to be having, but unfortunately, we're not having it. And I think until we get there, it is going to be difficult to get over this hurdle, this perception of vulnerability, so we can tackle all the other important issues that we've been talking about here today.
I was involved in the last effort at legalization, and it was an abysmal failure. And the reason it was an abysmal failure is because we became all things to all people. President Bush is a great guy. He appointed me, but it was the White House abdicated immigration reform to Congress. And when you have 100 senators and a couple hundred representatives all wanting what's in it for them, I want this, I want that. If you vote for this, I'm not voting for you. There were poison pills. There were backstabbings. I remember vividly, I had to give a speech in Orlando in front of like 500 members of a national Hispanic group, and as I was getting on the podium, my BlackBerry went off, and there was only one line: immigration reform failed in the Senate. Boy, that was a lot of fun, because I was actually giving a speech about how this thing was going to pass. But, you know, one of the things that we all have in common, I think we've mentioned, is the role of perception. Perception becomes reality. We have a domestic terror attack, and the next thing you see on TV is shots of the U.S. border with Mexico. One has nothing to do with the other. And the only way that we can have, I think, meaningful immigration reform, America's a great place. We all love immigrants, but we hate immigration. You know, and we have to somehow reconcile the fact that immigrants are here because of immigration. And I think border security is something that needs to be treated as that, border security. And unless you're some wildly, you know, let everybody in person, I think most people will agree that national boundaries need to be respected and that countries need to be able to defend their borders. That should be taken as one issue. Another issue is, what do you do with 10, 11, 12 undocumented people inside the United States? That's another issue. And then lastly is prospectively, how do we fix our immigration system so that we don't have these problems? And I think those are three very achievable things to do if you do them as individual policy items. When you put them all together, it'll never happen.
You know, I take a little different view of that in the sense that you look at the Republican Congress, and for 4 years they've been talking about border security, and they have yet to pass a border security bill, not one, which I find to be astonishing. And the reason they haven't passed it is because they can't. They can't get it out of their own Congress. And so I think, I think it's for a variety of reasons. There's a few members who I think, frankly, in the southern, some from not that far from this area, some of them in Texas and other areas, who have a greater understanding of the border and realize some of the stuff being proposed is not the most efficient way to deal with the problem. There's others on the far right who think anything it doesn't go far enough, and so there's not enough members to pass it. And so you need Democrats. One of the great political things I've never understood about President Obama is why he just didn't say, "Send me a border security bill. You guys have been talking about border security for years. Why don't you send it to me and I'll sign it?" Because anything that would have gone through Congress would have been okay from his point of view, because it would have actually had a Democratic input, not only get to the House, but obviously get to the Senate. So I think the coalitions, to your point, at some level, the coalition's going to be different. I do think that the bills, it's hard to imagine one bill going through now. You're going to have some, you're going to have 3 or 4 things lined up, and some people vote for 2, some people vote for 3, some people vote for 4, and that's how it'll pass. But I do think there's not, we are still at a point where we need bipartisan support to pass anything. And I think about this perception problem, and I often think about Lindsey Graham, who, is really in the thick of this stuff. And Lindsey Graham goes out and sells it. I mean, part of the issue of Congress people and our legislators, they got to go sell it. They got to go back to their constituents, explain to them what's happening, go over it, and say this is the problem, and this is how we're going to deal with it. And a lot of time we have members, Archbishop raised it in the previous panel, which I want to go down a rabbit hole, but gerrymandering has really changed a lot of things, and we have a lot of members who don't want to go out and sell things anymore. They don't want to go sell tough ideas. And but you look at Graham, who went out there and travels all around South Carolina. South Carolina's changing demographically as far as like just the ideological makeup of the state. So it's not the South Carolina it was 10 years ago, but nonetheless, it's a very conservative place. And he gets 70% of the vote in the primary, the guy who led the charge. And why does he do that? Because he goes home and he sells it. And, I just...
Emilio's point that Americans hate immigration but like immigrants.
Yeah, you just got to go. You got to go and make the case to people. And we have too few people who want to make the case, which is why I think a large reason why we have some of this perception problems that we do.
I just want to go back to the question about the border and security, because I think, I'm actually concerned. I mean, this is actually not just on the Republican side, but even the Democratic side. I mean, I think you're hearing people say, well, we need to secure the border, and it just becomes very abstract. Like, what does that actually mean? And I think that, especially having worked with, with Republicans in the past, I mean, I picked up now that, and it took me maybe a while because I was naive, but I mean, sometimes when you continue saying, well, let's secure the border and then we'll deal with everything else, that just becomes essentially an excuse not to do anything. And so I think part of the challenge, I think, for all of us is really moving the public to get beyond this idea that until we secure the border, whatever that means, then we can tackle other issues. Because as I was noting earlier, I mean, I think in some places, it's like private property is in between, like the on the U.S.-Mexico border, and you've got, even like wildlife issues, like where you can't secure the border because certain wildlife has to come back and forth. I mean, these are things that, just make it impractical to just have a wall, an impenetrable wall, like is being talked about in this campaign, and so. That's a challenge, I think, in terms of selling policy, but I think it's necessary. I mean, if this is going to happen, there is an educational component that's required.
Can I say just one quick thing that's important for all Americans to recognize? There is no such thing as an impenetrable wall. I was down in the San Diego-Tijuana corridor recently where there's, 15-foot high fence with circular coiled barbed wire at the top. It's not a fence anybody's going to get over. But at night when the fog comes in, they cut through the fence and they go through it. The Border Patrol agent showed me in several places tunnels that went from a quarter-mile in from the Mexican side into warehouses a quarter-mile in on the U.S. side. There are a zillion ways over, under, around, and through any kind of wall. So it's the silliest idea I've ever heard.
And there's migration patterns nowadays too. I mean, the news of Haitians traveling 7,000 miles to Brazil to try to get to the States, and it's.
Along those point, it makes the sell much more difficult when you read stories like that, because the United States is probably the most generous country when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers in the world. Yet, it's very hard for somebody who agrees with us that we need reform to then justify how is it that somebody can go from Haiti to Brazil and cross 11 countries where they could probably stay and settle, yet they want to come to the U.S. That becomes an impossible sell, because if you're being persecuted, you're more than welcome. But at that point, then you go country shopping. And it sounds trite, but people that think like we do and are interested in reform have to explain those questions and have to explain those ideas to their voters. When we were,
How do you explain that question?
it's tough. I'll give you another one. When we were doing the last shot at immigration reform, because immigration reform writ large is very nice, but when you get into the weeds, it gets dirty and ugly. And you have to deal with things like who's going to pay for it? What thresholds do we have? What documentation will we accept? So then you get into issues, threshold. If Amelia Gonzalez has been ordered deported 4 times, and all I do is move to different states, 4 times by a federal judge, by the way, should Amelia Gonzalez be available for a legalization program? I had that conversation with Senator Cornyn, who genuinely believes in reform, but as a former Supreme Court justice in Texas, he says, hey, if a U.S. citizen is told by a federal magistrate, a federal judge, I'm sorry, Mr. Jesmer, I've heard your case, we've heard your appeals, you gotta go. You know what? You gotta go. So how many bites at the apple would these individuals be allowed to take under a future immigration policy? And these are, if you want to call it, it's not minutia, but these are important segments of overall policy, because you may get X number of senators or House members that say, you know what, I think that immigration judge was probably wrong, and you should have an 8th bite at the apple. Or you get people that say, man, if I go before a federal judge and he tells me to stand on my head, I'm standing on my head, because I've exhausted all options. So these are the nuances that we have to tackle, and it goes back to perception. And circling back to your original point.
This is a communication problem.
Well, it's like cool hand Luke, a failure to communicate. But again, it's very tough for somebody to say, hey, you know what, it's okay if there are however many thousand Haitians on the U.S.-Mexican border. But gee, if they live in Haiti, why are they going through 11 countries to get to the U.S. when they could have stayed in any one of those 11 countries and probably had a better life than they would have had they stayed in Haiti? That's a very tough question to ask a voter, and it's a very tough question for a voter to internalize and say, well, if you're being persecuted, we'll take you. We understand America's a land of second chances, and we bring in people who've been persecuted. But just because Costa Rica didn't suit your needs, I'm going to pack up and head north. And those issues are tough issues for members of Congress.
I just wanted, as you were talking, I was thinking about the headline. I think many of us saw it. I think it was last week, where the Department of Homeland Security incorrectly issued citizenship to people who had committed crimes or were not even supposed to be in this country. So I think that's a reality. I mean that's happening, and I think when you add that with public opinion polls showing that the American people have very little trust in government, and Congress is at an all-time low. I mean, that's the other challenge too, is that people just don't have a lot of faith in government right now, and so when proposals come up where we're going to do something big like comprehensive immigration reform, that's a challenge, and not to conflate too many policy issues, but with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, I mean that was an example of a big bill that again polls show that slight majority of people are not entirely happy with with how that's being implemented. And so I think that's another challenge too, is that as we're thinking about these things, that just the trust of the American people and our public elected officials is another hurdle that we have to overcome.
Well, part of it, I think, is, as we all know, it's just so partisan. And I think about this issue that just happened with the 850 number. Look, that's a disgrace. I mean, that should not have happened, any measure. And instead, what frustrates me as someone who wants to see this badly pass is that, there's always criticism of Republicans and not doing it. And, I share much of that sentiment. But But sometimes I wish the left would take opportunities, like when these things happened, got out and said, "Yeah, this shouldn't have happened. Like this shouldn't have happened. We need to clean this up." They at times, I think, poo-poo border security. It's kind of like whatever they need. I just want to get, and they don't really sell that. Yeah, but they generally want to secure the border and stop future flow, which is part of the thing. I think if you deal, and I work with many great people across the spectrum, but sometimes you kind of talk to them, and there's like. It's kind of like that some people, to your point, are not going to be able to come in. Like it's not going to be an open border. We are going to have a deal where we're going to. The only way we can deal with people here is to legalize them. How we do that, when they get citizenship, if they get citizenship, all that stuff will be worked out. But that's the only realistic and, frankly, way that's consistent with our values. But that doesn't mean that everyone. I think the American people want to take that bite. To your point of view, if they know that future flow is going to be restricted, or at least we're going to understand how it's coming. And I think the left does a very poor job of selling their commitment to that concept. And so it breeds this kind of, I think, distrust that this is going to be the kind of final deal. We're going to make this deal. We're going to get it past us. It's going to, and I think that's problematic as well.
So just a quick question, Emilio, because you're here, former director of USCIS. How could something like that happen, that 800 plus people were naturalized?
CIS is actually the agency that executes the final paperwork. It happens because nobody did the right background checks before it got to CIS. It has to be staffed through ICE and all the other agencies, and then when the file comes to CIS, it has all the approvals. So the immigration adjudicator will see that the file is complete, everything's approved, there's nothing negative to report, this person gets through. To your point on the left, I remember when I was getting beat up because of the delays in naturalizations. I had a meeting with several Democratic members of Congress, senators, and one of them turned to me and said, a guy I know, he's actually a good friend, he goes, "Well, why don't we just naturalize everybody, and then if we find a bad apple, we'll take it away from them." And this guy's a lawyer, and his name sounds like Bob Menendez, but I'm like, Bob, do you realize how hard it is to strip somebody of their citizenship?
It is hard.
It's almost, you almost have to commit treason in front pretty much in front of a stadium full of witnesses. So by the time, again, the process is very, very long. Sometimes it can be really long. My issue with the wait times was that the FBI was doing name checks, and the FBI doesn't care about anything other than the FBI. So all the immigration name checks were at the bottom of the pile, and they continue to be at the bottom of the pile. And we had to write them a check for quite a few $1 million so they could hire more people to do it. But it is a process. It is a process. And these 800 or 900 people that got these citizenships, it's going to take a bunch of lawyers, full-time job, months if not years, to strip them of their citizenships.
So we've touched on it a bit, but I'd like to get into deportation and whether or not, I think that there are a lot of reasonable proposals about security, and we're going to continue to debate that aspect of immigration reform. What about deportation? Emilio, you mentioned You know, the 8, 9, 10, 11 million undocumented.
Well, you have to create a threshold. If let's say we go down the path of naturalization, where do you draw the line? I mean, okay, if you had to have been deported fewer than 6 and no greater than 8, because at that point you're a serial lawbreaker. And to the point of some colleagues of mine in the Senate, a lot of people come to the U.S. because they're fleeing countries where there's no rule of law. And the first thing you do when you come to the U.S. is violate the law. So there's an incongruency there. The other thing is, when you deport somebody, you have to know where you're deporting them to. So as an example, I think the number's now probably approaching 100,000 people in the United States that are Chinese nationals that have been ordered deported. But guess what? China says they're not Chinese. China says they're ethnic Chinese. They could be from Singapore, they could be from Taiwan, they could be from Malaysia. So until you can get a country to take back its citizens, they're here. That's a backdoor amnesty, and there's nothing you can do about it. So one of the things that we tried with immigration reform, by the way, Mexico has one of the best citizen identification agencies I've ever seen in my life. I've actually visited them. You can walk into just about any Mexican government office and get an ID. You can go into any Mexican consulate and get a passport. So one of the things about, and this is where we get into the underbrush and the nitty-gritty, if we're going to legalize all you people, who are you? And you know what? And I want to know where you're coming from. Because if you go bad on me, I want to know where to send you home. Because right now, Emilio Gonzalez can say he's Honduran. And the Honduran government could say, we've never heard of him. And then all of a sudden, I'm here forever. Because nobody will take me back because nobody says I exist. And this is just one example. But to your point, if you don't have a threshold, if you don't have rules, if you don't have, if you lack of a better term, you know, red lines to cross, then it's an amnesty. You have to draw the line. Some people you have to, Mother Teresa said no to people sometimes, I'm sure. You have to be able to look somebody in the eye and say, you know what, just not working for you. And then you work on the other 11 or 12 or 27 people that's working for them. But deportation, and it's very passionate, you know, this whole business of families are breaking up and perception.
I was just going to say quickly, I think one of the things that has been so difficult in this debate for so long is making a distinction between people who came here in an era when the United States really wasn't enforcing its laws and people who are coming here now when we're actually trying to. One of the people who was on the task force that I worked on with Jeb Bush and Mac McClarty was the Reverend Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention, and in recent years they've been up there with the Catholics and other religious groups and very strongly pushing for immigration reform. And he would say, for years we held up 2 signs at the U.S.-Mexico border. One said, no trespassing. The other said, help wanted. And the fact is, you had millions of people who came in under those circumstances. And so I think a lot of us are really quite ambivalent about, well, should we be taking a hardline enforcement stance on people who came here in the 1990s when our demand for labor was extraordinary and there was a wink, wink, nod, nod, come here, we'll find a job for you, and we're not enforcing our laws seriously. And suddenly we're going to change our minds and say, yeah, no, we mean it now, and so we're going to arrest you even though you've been in the country for 15 years and you've got U.S. citizen kids and we're going to deport you. It's not surprising people feel ambivalent about that. But then there's the issue of, are we going to have a system that has integrity going forward? Because I think increasingly we have the capability, which we didn't in the 1990s, to have a system that has integrity. And I agree with Rob. I think, I think the left actually needs to get behind this and to say, look, we need a system with laws that we're going to enforce. So for asylees, for instance, who are arriving at the border, that means, enough money that they can be processed promptly. I would favor appointing counsel for them so they actually have a decent chance of making their case before the immigration court. But if the answer is no, the handcuffs are put on them and they get sent back, right? No means no. No doesn't mean you get to live in the country another 5 years until somebody decides it's time to deport you. And I would be, again, with illegal immigration across the border, I'd be in favor of larger legal worker programs. So there are more legitimate options for people to come in the United States. We used to do that in the 1950s and 60s. We stopped doing that for reasons that made sense at the time. But so if there were more legal options, then we said, look, there are ways that you can come and work in the United States. If you're not availing yourself of those and you choose to break our laws, we're going to enforce them with seriousness. And somehow we've got to be able to make that distinction between the legacy problem in which, face it, there were big mistakes made on both sides, both the people who chose to break the law and our country for not enforcing it, and what we want to do going forward, which is to actually have a system with some integrity. And that does mean saying no and enforcing no.
A lot of very strange cases that would come to me that nobody wanted to make a decision on. And if you know an immigration officer, you should ask him about a red card file. A red card file is usually a paper file the size of a phone book. And as you open it up, on the left-hand side, there's a red card, and it says in big black letters, "Do not read." Hell, I'm going to read it. This much paper, do not read. And then you read this stuff, and you're horrified. Like, I don't want this person not only not living next to me, I don't want them in my state. These people are citizens. And the reason is because when past legalizations were enacted, it was, we got to get as many people through. We got to, the idea of you got to bring people in from the shadows. By the way, what I'm telling you is what I heard dozens, if not hundreds of times from members of Congress. You're in such a hurry to bring people in from the shadows. I don't want to know about Jesmer. He's a good-looking guy. He's tall. He's got a job. He's willing to pay his taxes. Got a wife and 3 kids. I don't want to know. I want to know, because what he's been doing in Oklahoma is something nobody should be doing. And you see case after case after case, and what it does is, internally, the immigration officers really are disgusted with what they have to do every day. And that's another issue. It's kind of like a minor issue, but it's a whole internal bureaucracy of, do you want bureaucrats in immigration that want to be helpful, or do you want immigration bureaucrats that see this as an opportunity to pursue their own agenda? And it happens. And it happens when you see this type of thing. Again, this is the underbrush of immigration. These are the things that you have to tackle when you say, let's do immigration reform. Okay, and then the definition. What is immigration reform? Which is, to my original point, I think we have to break this up, because if we try and do this all at one time, it's not going to happen. Nobody's going to take the risk. It becomes politically toxic to people who should be friends of ours, unless we break it up and, to everybody's point, get the left to support border reform. Whatever you want to do on the border, it shouldn't just be a Republican imperative. It should be a national imperative, and it should be handled as what it is, border security. Put that off to the side. Then you can talk about, to your point, what do we do with the 11, 12 million people that are here? Our options are very limited as to what we do with those people, but we need to address it. And then prospectively, the paper that the forum wrote on our broken visa policy. We have so many visas now. If you don't qualify for one of our visas, wow, we don't want you. Because anybody can get into the United States with one of our visas. We have visas for pro players, amateur players. I had a guy put in for an O visa. You know how he got in? Because he took my picture off a website, a guy from China, and he painted my portrait, sent me the portrait, and he's, according to him, the best portrait artist in China. Great picture. He got an O visa. But the point is, I think, yeah. We have way too many visa categories, to the point where just about anybody can get in under any category. And I think they're old, they're antiquated. We need to relook at our visa policy. Our visa policy should always be, I think, family-based, but it needs to be economically based. We need to bring in the best and the brightest. We need to retain the best and the brightest. And that's another conversation that I think our friends on the left would probably want to have with us. If you're getting a PhD in physics from MIT, gosh, I want you to stay. Because his only other option is to marry somebody from Denmark. Because if you're Danish, the chances of you getting in quickly are quite good.
I want to open it up to questions, but I want to quickly ask Rob, what's the cost of deporting people? Is it even feasible?
It's really not. I mean, it's not for a variety of reasons. One, economically, the American Action Forum has did a study, and it costs upwards like $600 billion, which is just not something we're going to produce. Not to mention the fact you'd have to hire tens of thousands of federal agents, which always I always ask my friends who think this is a viable option. It's like, okay, well, when they get deported, then what are they going to do? They're always worried about, the black helicopter over their head. So maybe they'll do that. But but there's also, as everyone knows who's serious about this, there's major due process issues. You can't just pick someone up and throw them out. They have to go through due process, and there's not enough immigration judges and representation for those. So it's a massive. That's what I'm saying. There really is no issue, and really from a security point of view, this is soundbitey, but the facts speak to themselves. We talk to people about this. The sooner we can process the people who, the overwhelming majority, which we processed and go through some for legalization, then we really could focus on, if you're a bad actor in this country and you're in some, gang that originated in Honduras and now you're living in LA, you're not going to probably step forward and try and get legalized, right? And if you are, that'd be great. You'll be thrown out. And if you aren't, it does allow federal law enforcement to focus on the bad actors who are here. So it's not just a practical point of view, it's actually a security point of view. And there's still, there is a great, there's a lot of prioritization now anyway, but it would be better if we did that. So it's just not. Look, I've done hundreds of meetings with people on this issue, on the Hill and everywhere else, and they get behind closed doors, and everybody knows that the only option is to provide some sort of pathway to legalization. No one, literally no one, with the exception of very few people, dispute that. Like I said, some want 7 years, some want 4, some want 9, but no one says, with the exception of our presidential nominee, says we should deport 11 million people.
So, questions? Jerry, let me pass you this because it's to get you on the video to get the questions.
So I just want to follow up on that one because I've funded an immigration reform for 16 years now. I've been seeing every single point, and every single time there's a possibility for a bill to go through, it's more and more money for security. I think the last one was $60 billion, and that wasn't even enough to get the House to actually move on it, right? So, to me, what you just said, the last point is the right. It is a security issue. If we actually could get the 10 million people or 11 million people here to come out and actually step forward, and you get them checked, and then they can actually be on a path to legalization. To me, that's the security message. But you're not going to get them out unless people are feeling they're comfortable about coming out, and they're not going to be deported. So, it's almost like catch-22. It's never moving forward, and it's a political issue. It's really not, frankly, at this point, a research issue or even an economic issue. As you said, everybody wants it, but it's the House. The House is just really unwilling to move it forward. And I think what someone said about redistricting is a good point, but how much longer do people have to wait to actually get this through?
Well, I liked Speaker Boehner a lot and thought he was with us on this issue. But Speaker Ryan is, I think, I have tremendous hope for his willingness to do this and do the tough things. I actually think Chuck Schumer will be a good on the Senate side and the new Senate majority. I think Reid was just poisonous for basically everything for Republicans. So there'll be some fresh faces, and we'll have a new president. And so I think there'll be a little bit. Look, what I always say to my Republican friends, some of which are clients who run, I say that this is never going to be easy. You know what I mean? Like there's not, if you're looking for the perfect time where no one's going to criticize you, we have people who are on radio and on blogs. This is how they make their living. This is how they feed their family and pay their mortgage, is to go spin people up. They're not just going to stop. And so part of this, I don't know if I can say this here, but I say, it's time to put your big boy pants on. Let's go and do it. Like it just, you gotta just go do it. And I've often used this analogy, which I don't know if it's very good, but if you watch these, I have little kids, they love these nature shows. And if you watch like the migration of animals that like cross the river, they all cross together. And there's like, always one or two animals that like, there's a predator and they kill one of or two of them. But, the thousands and thousands that we're making across the river, right? And I always say to people, if you just if instead of trying to pin off one here and one there, if we got 200 Republicans to vote for it and 45 Republican senators to vote for it and really just got behind it, the politics actually is much easier for people to manage if they do it in bigger numbers and smaller numbers. And I'm not speaking. I'm just speaking in factual terms. If Secretary Clinton's elected president, she will be the most unpopular person in the since modern polling to be elected. And you would think that'd be some sort of wake-up call to some people who want to do things. We'll have to see. We got to keep on. I mean, look, she said she's going to bring it up if she's elected. I believe it's coming, and we're going to have to deal with it. And I hope I said, I think there's a lot of emphasis on what the right can do better. I do think the left, they need to do their part as well.
If I could just pick on that quickly, since I wrote a story about this for OpportunityLives.com about Clinton's promise to enact immigration, because she's made it very clear. She said she's going to do something within the first 100 days in office, and so So I think that's a problem. I think that is a problem because you're setting these expectations, and as someone who's worked in Congress, but also someone who's been following this issue for a long time, I mean, some of just even now in these couple hours we've been out here, I mean, we've thrown out a lot of questions. These are really tough questions, and sort of to say that we're going to just do this in 100 days, I think to me is a little bit disingenuous of how difficult this really is. And so I've talked to immigration activists about this, and they are concerned because if Democrats don't deliver on immigration, I mean, this will be the third time essentially that they've been told, we're going to do this, and then it doesn't happen. And so that's I think important to put out there. And then I think my other fear though is that it's possible that if Secretary Clinton is elected and then she does want to follow through with this, that she will just circumvent Congress and just do this by executive order. And that'd be a disaster. I think Republicans would be rightly upset. I think actually a lot of Americans would be rightly upset. And so that's another fear that I have about this.
Thank you. Hey guys. I guess I just have a question, since all of you guys work in national security, kind of what the fear is, because we keep talking about perception, and a lot of times I feel like, at least in this country, at least from what I've seen, a lot of that fear ends up looking a lot like racism, and not necessarily from actual things happening. Like we just mentioned, it's a Mexican that gets drunk, he's all over the headlines. There's plenty of Americans that get drunk and drive, aren't in the headlines. So I'd just like to hear a little bit about that, and kind of, when we say things like good or bad people, kind of like what that means, even drug trafficking, human trafficking, who are the consumers? Americans. And so, thank you.
So I think that immigration has kind of become a proxy for a lot of what ails us right now, be it the economy or security or the changing face of America, which people find daunting.
I mean, from a sort of border security perspective, I actually think there are two fears, and they both have some level of legitimacy. I think the one fear is what happened in Europe over the last year, which was a massive flow of refugees from a horrific conflict in Syria. And the Europeans were in a position where they were unable to control their borders at all in order to try to make vetting decisions on who was coming in. And we can debate the specifics and the morality and all of that. I think what Germany did was really heroic in a lot of ways in letting in that many people. But the reality is the process was completely out of control. And the German people reacted very badly. People generally want to believe that immigration into their country is controlled in some way. I mean, you can debate what the numbers are and who we should let in and why, but they want to believe their government has some level of control. And so I think one of the sort of base public fears is just this notion that it is out of control. And I think if you look back at the history of the US-Mexico border, it never was under control. For most of our history, that wasn't a problem. In the 80s and 90s and 2000s, it became a much bigger problem. And so I think there is a public demand for control. I think that's the sort of big picture issue. I think narrower, there is the question of terrorism, which is in the previous panel we heard this was a problem in the teens and 1920s too. So it's not a brand new problem, but it is certainly a problem for our time. There are groups that are trying to inspire people who are willing to do really outrageous things, go and kill mass numbers of civilians for no reasons. And post 9/11, we're pretty scared of that. And so I think as a country, we want to be able to use our borders as a way of trying to identify people who are going to do us harm. And I actually believe that's really important. I actually think we've done quite a good job of it. But I think those are the two fears. And I both think they have a level of legitimacy. That's not to discount the level of, level of racism in this country, which honestly has kind of shocked me in this campaign. I think it's deeper than I recognized that it was. But I do think that there are a lot of legitimate concerns that Americans have that public policy makers need to address seriously.
Just to follow up quickly on that, because I think the other thing that I feel like racism and xenophobia has always been around, but I think that as the economy, especially in the last few years, just took a downturn, it made it easier to blame an immigrant for taking your job. And then you start seeing these people who have these racist views be more open about it. Even on social media, they can be anonymous, and so they do this. And so, this is more of a rhetorical question. I mean, I just wonder, as the economy continues to improve, I mean, you are seeing like the unemployment rate is going down, consumer confidence is ticking up a little bit. If that holds steady, I mean, I do wonder if that will create an environment, or at least help create an environment that's conducive to some type of immigration reform.
But the economy's part of it. But I think, Ted, to your point about the level of xenophobia and racism, that's really shocking. It's come to the surface. But, we're living in a, for English Press One culture that people are reacting to as well, right?
Yeah, no, and that brings up a sort of a broader conversation about assimilation, about how we integrate our immigrants, which again, these are not easy things to address, but I think that is a part of what's required and what's necessary if we're gonna, say like we are integrating immigrants well, as opposed to like say Germany, and if people have that and say, oh yeah, this is happening, then it could make people more open to be more welcoming of immigrants, increasing the number of visas for high skilled and low skilled immigrants.
Really quick comment. I know other
ahead.
people
No,
want to
no,
say,
go ahead.
but I think one of the things we've done a very poor job of in public policy is actually bringing out the inherent generosity of the American people. The Canadians have this program where individuals, churches, communities can sponsor refugees. That's the way they're settling a lot of the Syrian refugees. I hosted a meeting with John McCallum, the Canadian immigration minister, recently. He told me, he said, I must be the only immigration minister in the world whose problem is I can't find enough refugees to satisfy the public demand for resettling them. We don't do that in this country. Play on what I actually think is a much deeper generosity than we're tapping into, and I wish we would.
Americans are enormously generous.
I used to work a lot with our Canadian counterparts, and they have a very different take on immigration. Their foreign ministry actually grades their embassies on their ability to recruit people to emigrate to Canada. So every year or so, the Canadian Parliament, the government, puts up a list that says, we need industrial engineers, cardiologists, whatever. And then they send this out to the Canadian embassies around the world, and it's their job to recruit these people to move to Canada. Just as an interesting, funny anecdote, I was meeting my counterpart, and I said, what's keeping you up at night? And he said, Ukrainian barmaids. And I said, why? What? And he said, yeah, because some members of parliament were inserted into that list of priorities, Ukrainian barmaids to work in the western provinces in Alberta, Saskatchewan, because it's really cold there and nobody wants to live there. So, and whatever the restaurant industry had sort of circled the wagons and said, we need to put a marker down and you guys need to help us get people to work. So they actually, he said, it'll never go under my signature, but, somebody else will have to sign it. But to your point, they have a process, and that process is dictated by the needs of the Canadian society writ large, primarily economic.
A couple of thoughts on this. One is, I do think that I'm not a fan of our nominee and for a variety of reasons, and or his rhetoric, but I do think people, I made this joke. I've lived in D.C. I'm from St. Paul, Minnesota, but I lived in D.C. for since 1999, and I've never felt more like I've never thought of myself as an elitist. I've never felt more like an elitist in the last year than I have. And I think that I check myself because I do think you have, Donald Trump's going to get somewhere north of 40 million votes. Could get 50 million votes. Could get more than that. That is a lot of people who he has tapped into, and they're not all racists, and they're not all ignorant, and they're not all idiots. Certainly, some of them are. There's just as I think there's people on Secretary Clinton's team that have voters who I don't trust all their motives. So my point is this: it's not unreasonable. We have a lot. Our country's going. The Archbishop actually touched on this in the previous panel. Our economy is changing. Things are happening. This is a long problem, systemic problem. But people are really insecure about their future and are nervous about it. And I think at times, all of us are fortunate to have good lives and good livings and all that kind of stuff. We're a little just globally a little dismissive of it, and I don't think that's very helpful for any of our goals. And I don't, when I talked about it earlier, it's not unreasonable. My dad called me. My dad, I'm sure if anyone who works in politics, my dad believes I can fix anything that's happening in Washington, D.C. So everything goes wrong, he calls. He's like, why aren't you? And it's like, okay, well, can't really do that. But he was, I know I touched on this earlier, but he was very upset about this poor woman who died in San Francisco at the hands of this undocumented murder. And he's like, I just don't understand why this happened. And I got to tell you, I don't understand why it happened either. I mean, this is a person who should have been deported. And instead of, and I think with all due respect to your question, I don't think the answer is, well, Americans commit murders at the same rate as undocumented or this or that. I don't think that sells in the middle America. I think what sells in the middle America is those people need to go. You know what I mean? We got to do a better job. We got to secure the border, and they need to go. And they are in fact bad people. Not many of them, but they are in fact bad people. And we're going to do a better job of dealing with those. We're going to make part of immigration reform needs to be centered around we're going to make the country safer, we're going to make it more prosperous, and we're going to hit on this stuff and touch on some of the themes that people are worried about. So let me just close with this, which is somewhat of a non sequitur, but it's one of the things I'm most frustrated about with what's happened with our nominee about all this. He does provide kind of quick answers, and some of this that we're going to bring these jobs back and all this kind of stuff. All we're doing, like I said, the economy is changing, and we are selling false hope to people who really we need to provide a different avenue of training and vocation so they can make a living. But he is talking to them in a way that I think people are understanding, and it's just I just don't want to be dismissive of. I think Donald Trump's a psychopath. I don't want him to be our president. But he's going to get 50 million votes, and we need to recognize that and not be dismissive of all those people who are voting for him.
Well, listen, conscious of the time, I'm going to thank our panelists, and then I'm going to ask Ali Noorani to give us some closing remarks. So thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Please join me in giving him a round of applause. So last night, while many of us were watching the debate, I got a text from Jimmy Kemp, and he got hit by a sinus infection. So he was bedridden, and then decided, okay, I'm going to drag myself to the airport. Problem is, he dragged himself to the wrong airport. But what he did is shared with me the reason why he found this very important. He found this issue very important because for him and his family, it went back to Proposition 187, where Jack Kemp took a leadership role in pushing back against Prop 187, which is moving through California. And Jimmy and the Family Foundation and their public policy perspective on this was that we need a much more constructive approach to the immigration debate. So that's why we are really thrilled to be partnering with the Kemp Foundation, not just on this event, but some work that we started over the course of the summer on the Hill and some things that are moving forward through the remainder of the year into 2017. I really want to thank Rudy Fernandez and the folks here at the University of Miami. Rudy and his staff have been just a real great partners on this, and Rudy's been a great partner and a great friend of the organization and the issue for many, many, many years. I also really want to thank Jerry Mannion and her colleague Andrew for support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Without their generous support, not only this event, but the work that we've started over the summer and into next year would not be possible. And then Americans for Conservative Direction, our other sponsor of the event and the work. So my takeaway from this morning, but also where we are at this point, is that there's a pretty clear choice. And the choice is, quite frankly, between a constructive approach to this question of immigrants and immigration, or resorting to really being to a culture of fear and anxiety. And I think Rob, put it very succinctly. I mean, at the end of the day, Donald Trump could very well get 40 to 50 million votes. And I think the worst thing that we can do is dismiss those concerns, because those are real concerns. Those are concerns based on anxiety, fear, but they're concerns that we can answer through the policy conversation that we had today, whether it's around visa reform, better border security, a better understanding of our economic and social needs behind a reformed immigration system. So for those of us here at the National Immigration Forum, and last but certainly not least, I want to thank Kathleen Farrell for being the point person on this great event and making sure that this moves forward. We're very, very thrilled to be here this morning, and thank you for taking the time. And I know many people traveled for it, and Abby Chase and her team here in Miami for being great partners and allies, and we look forward to the work ahead. So thank you very, very much.